This is the Expert Series podcast from the CDA Institute, Canada's premier defense and security think tank. I'm Josh Malm, and it's Friday, January 16th, 2026. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Expert Series podcast. If this is your first time listening, welcome to the CDA Institute community. We're a nonpartisan think tank that produces evidence-based research on security and defense policy. If you're a returning listener and enjoy the podcast, consider subscribing to our YouTube channel or following us on your preferred streaming platform. Before we dive into today's episode, I have some exciting news. We've just opened registration for the 94th Ottawa Conference on Security and Defense, taking place March 4th to 5th, 2026, at the Fairmont Chateau Laurier in Ottawa. This year's theme, The Road to 5%, focuses on Canada's commitment to raise defense spending to 5% of GDP by 2035. Over 2 days, we'll be discussing the challenges and opportunities this investment presents, and we'll cover topics like defense procurement, national security resilience, innovation, and Canada-US relations. The conference brings together senior government officials, military leaders, academics, industry experts, and is Canada's premier national security and defense forum. To learn more or register, head over to cdainstitute.ca, click on events, and find the Ottawa Conference page. Now, on to today's episode. The role of Canada's National Security and Intelligence Advisor has become increasingly pivotal and responds to a rapidly changing global security environment. The NSIA was tasked with ensuring better coordination across Canada's security and intelligence agencies, streamlining decision-making, and providing direct, high-level advice to the Prime Minister on critical national security matters. Over the years, the role has expanded in scope as the definition of national security has broadened. As Canada faces an increasingly deteriorating and dynamic international security environment, the NSIA's role is more important than ever. Vincent Rigby and Adam Chapnick recently authored a paper for the Centre for International Governance Innovation titled Getting Serious About National Security. In that paper, they explore the evolution of the NSIA role, its growing importance in today's security environment, and they offer insights on how Canada can strengthen its national security framework. Today, I'll be speaking with them about how the NSIA has developed over time, the challenges it faces today, and how the position can continue evolving in an increasingly dangerous, unstable world. Adam Chapnick is the Deputy Director of Education at the Canadian Forces College and a Professor of Defense Studies at the Royal Military College of Canada. Vincent Rigby is the Slater Family Professor of Practice at the Max Bell School of Public Policy at McGill University, a CDA Institute board member, and a former National Security and Intelligence Advisor to the Prime Minister. Now, on to the discussion. Vincent and Adam, thanks so much for joining us once again today.
Pleasure to be here.
Thank you very much for having us, Josh.
Maybe you could dive in and explain the paper a bit more, the rationale for writing it, if you could expand on that, and what you ultimately hope for readers and decision makers to take away from it. And then from there, we can maybe move on into the specifics.
Sure. I've been teaching in a national security program, a graduate program for senior military personnel and senior public servants at the Canadian Forces College for close to 20 years. And we call it a national security program, and the National Security Advisor is a regular speaker in the program. But I found that we really didn't know that much about where this job came from. And I'm trained in history, and those are the things I tend to be curious about. So for a number of years, I'd wanted to figure out where this job came from and how it had evolved. I didn't think, however, I could do it by myself for a couple of reasons. The government is pretty hands tight when it comes to national security. There are no the documents would be almost impossible to access. And it therefore would take conversations with people who had held the job. And I'd often thought the best way to do this would be with someone else. And it just happened to be that after Vincent retired, he reached out because we'd been in touch many times before and asked if I wanted to do something with him. And it was the perfect request because Vincent knew everybody and had done the job himself. So together, we managed to speak to just about everyone who has ever held the job. And along with a little bit of additional research, we've been able to trace the job from the beginning until now and use that to inform ideas about where the job might go from here. And in doing that, we also got to tell a little bit of the story of national security policy, the history of national security policy in Canada.
I just have to say that, first of all, I was very honored that Adam would bring me in on this initiative because it's a really important initiative, as Adam said. to trace the evolution of the job, because no one's really talked about it. There's a gap in the literature, I think, when it comes to national security, that this is a position that's been around officially for about 20 years, but really goes back to the mid 1980s. And so, what is the role of the NSIA? How it has evolved, and as Adam said, what lessons can we learn to inform the future? Because I think one of the conclusions of the paper is that it's a really, really, really important position, and it's going to be potentially, given the threats that we're facing right now, an even more important position down the road. So I think when Adam mentioned it to me, I went, wow, this is great. I just happened to have been in a job for a little while, so I thought that's kind of cool. We also knew the NSI COP was going to be doing a study of the National Security Intelligence Advisor position. So we thought, oh, isn't this good? And we actually, I think, we didn't go at lightning speed at it, but I think near the end we were rushing it a little bit because we wanted to get it out ahead of the NSI COP report, which will hopefully be out soon. So it all came together quite nicely, and I have to tip my hat to Adam Egan, the driving force behind this. It was his brainchild, and I've been very lucky to tag along.
Well, thank you both for that introduction. Maybe we can start from a very basic position here for an audience that might not know all the dynamics of the NSIA role and how it interacts with the government and what it does for our national security. So I'll ask, what ultimately was the role kind of designed to do, or what's it meant to achieve? How has it evolved over time? And in its current configuration, is it suitable to meet the current challenges in the international system and the challenges facing Canadian defense and security? So whoever would like to take a stab first, go ahead, and then we'll go from there.
Well, I think what I'll do is I'll start with some of the early history, and as we get closer to Vincent's time, he can take over because he knows much better than I, because he lived it. Originally, the government really didn't have, if we go back even to the Second World War, much of a structure around sorting out national security and intelligence. If intelligence was being collected in different places, how could you bring all of it together? And if the prime minister needed to know something, or the government more broadly, the cabinet needed to know something, there was no real process to organize that material. Of course, in Canada, it turns out there was really no process to organize cabinet at all. We didn't have cabinet committees apart from wartime until the 1960s. By the 1960s, we start getting cabinet committees on issues like security, and as a result, we get public service support organized around deputy committees. A series of different scandals that caused the government to think that it has to take security a little bit more seriously over time bring us to the mid 1980s, when Brian Mulroney establishes the position of Security and Intelligence Coordinator within the Privy Council office, with the idea there being that whatever security and intelligence is being gathered around the town, it should be collected in one place for when the government needs access to it. So a former diplomat named J. Blair Seaborn, it becomes the first Security and Intelligence Coordinator. And that job, it's not a direct report to the prime minister. It's more an internal to government job, which gradually evolves as we get closer to events like 9/11, and becomes the national security the national security advisor job under Paul Martin at the end of 2003. And I'll hand the torch over right there.
Sure. For me, it's been really interesting looking at the history of the position, because I had certain, I think, preconceived notions of what the job was all about. And so I wasn't sure what I was going to discover as we looked under the hood and saw how others did the job. And I remember when I was at the Department of National Defense for the first 15 years of my career, and then I did work in IAS, the International Systems Secretary, for a while at PCO and other departments. So I was looking at it from the outside, and I had some sense of how the job was conducted, but it didn't really have details. But what struck me was that every NSA or NSIA that we interviewed had a slightly different take on what the job was about, but that fundamentally there were always 3 or 4 key precepts or responsibilities for the individual who held the position. I think the first was that you were basically there to support the prime minister. So it is the national security advisor, or the NSIA, to the prime minister. The clerk has a role, there's no doubt, and we can talk about the role of the clerk. It depended very much on the personality of the clerk and to what extent they wanted to get engaged. But you were there first and foremost to support the prime minister, to provide policy advice, but also to provide intelligence to the prime minister. So that's the the first role, and everybody talked about that, the importance of the relationship with the PM. The second one is what I used to call herding the cats, which is effectively coordinating the SNI community at the bureaucratic level. So reaching out to other deputy ministers, national defense, also with the CDS, not just the deputy minister, CSIS, CSE, public safety. The group is a little bit out going to accordion. It kind of opened and closed. But there were core deputies that really the NSIA had very close relationships with, reached out and coordinated activities, made sure that everybody was on the same page, made sure that everybody was aware of what the prime minister was thinking on national security issues, and made sure that all of this all the work got done. And then that is a big part of the job, and it's a challenging part of the job. I mean, obviously supporting the PM is challenging, but herding those cats was I think probably for me. And I would suspect Adam, from listening to other deputies who've done the job, the same for them. Managing that deputy community is a tough one. It's really, really tough. And then, so that's the up part, as Marie-Lucie Monin, one of the NSA said. There's the up, and then there's the across, and there's kind of the out part. I think those are the terms that she used, Adam. And that last part was reaching out beyond the government to talk to other stakeholders. So outside the federal government, talking to the provinces, talking to the territories, private sector, and particularly important, other allies. So Five Eyes, US, UK, Australia, New Zealand, other countries as required. And just really just making sure that Canada, again, was aligned with our allies and our partners. And that we were also using all those assets within Canada to the greatest extent possible, especially when things were very, very domestic. So I think those were kind of three general roles that are there throughout the history. There's a bit of a thread. Again, depending on which NSA you talk to, they may say, yeah, those are more or less three roles, but I spent a lot more time doing this than I did the other. I didn't see the PM that much, but oh boy, did I ever spend a lot of time with my DMs. Or you know what? I traveled a lot. I was doing a lot of stuff with other NSAs in other countries and so on and so forth. But that was more or less it, I'd say.
There was a time when the National Security Advisor was also the Deputy Minister at the Communications Security Establishment. There was a time when the advisor was also responsible for the personal security of members of Parliament directly. And I think that over time, as the strategic level responsibilities of the job got bigger, some of these tactical and operational responsibilities got lopped off, and for good reason. Depending on the prime minister, they've also chosen to use their advisor in different ways, either give them more to do or less to do, call them in, micromanage them, or leave them alone. So a lot of, I think Vincent's captured the big ideas, and then you get some adjustments depending on the time and the prime minister. And I guess
one of the things,
clerk.
I think one of the things we discovered, and I think we tried to capture it in the conclusion, is that the position was at its most prominent when you had a strong NSIA who had ideas and wanted to move those ideas and how to really advance the national security agenda in Canada. You had a threat environment, which was quite serious, and so that demanded attention. And then, as Adam just said, you had a prime minister who was engaged. And so that was almost like the perfect storm in a good way to actually make the NSIA front and center. I think it's always an important position, no matter what the threat environment is, how engaged the prime minister is. But if you have all three together with a very strong NSIA, that's when the job has really risen to greater prominence.
One thing I noted that was interesting while I was reading the paper, at different points in different NSIAs, you mentioned that some had more of an understanding and background in national security specifically. Some had more of an understanding of the bureaucracy, the mechanics of government. So I guess in an ideal world, the holder of the title would have a good understanding of both these things. But between having that really thorough understanding of national security, international security, and then that ability to maneuver around and work within the government, the bureaucracy, which do you think is more important for the role?
I'm curious if we come down on different sides of this. As an outsider looking in, my sense was that as long as you had a strong baseline in national security, not that you were necessarily a career national security professional, but that you had enough of a baseline, no matter how you acquired it, because a number of these folks acquired them in different ways. If you had that, What you really needed was this ability to, what Vincent calls, herd the cats. And you got that from understanding how government worked. So I would take most of the time someone with a good national security background with unbelievable expertise in center of government and managing government over someone with perfect national security credentials, but only a so-so understanding of how the system worked. I would choose the former over the latter personally.
Yeah, and I hope the gun's never put to the prime minister's head, and he's told, you got to make a decision one way or another. I'd actually would agree with what Adam says. I don't think you can put somebody in that position who has no experience or very little experience. I think that is extremely dangerous, especially because NSIAs often have to hit the ground running. They walk right into a crisis, and if you don't know up from down when it comes to national security issues, you're in trouble. So you need a solid grounding. I'd say better than just good, maybe, B plus, A minus. It doesn't have to be an A plus, but it's got to be a pretty damn strong B plus, A minus. But Adam's 100% right. I mean, what we discovered by talking to all the NSIAs and from my own experience counts for a lot. Seniority. I was a relatively junior deputy when I became NSIA, and I'm quite open in the paper, and I've said it in other forums that I was probably too junior in a lot of ways. You want somebody who's been a deputy for a while, who's seasoned, who's experienced, who has the respect of other deputies, who can convene them. And so if you got I had a lot of expertise, quite frankly. I'd been in the community, I'd been in international defense security throughout my career, but I didn't necessarily have a long period of time at the deputy level. So as Adam says, to know how the system works, to know how the governance works, to know how to bring everybody together, and just to have the gravitas and the instincts, like, okay, I know how to manage this situation, because so much at stake, right? So much is at stake. So that's why we say in the end, the perfect deputy, the perfect NSIA, has a lot of experience in security, has experience just in the government, has been a deputy for a while, is a known commodity, and can pull all this together. That's what you want at the end of the day.
I think one of the things to remember that we were reminded of by almost everyone we talked to is that, technically speaking, the NSIA doesn't have any authorities to force people to do things. The other deputies don't report to the NSIA. All the NSIA has is the idea that they can reach the prime minister directly more quickly than anyone else can, and that helps. But you don't want to invoke, the one power you have all the time. So really, it's the ability to cajole and negotiate and convince folks that it's in everyone's interest to cooperate without a whip behind you to really compel people to do things.
Yeah, it's a really important point, because you're at the center and you don't have a whole department behind you. I mean, you got to remember that the staff of the NSA, I think that was a common thread as well, Adam. It was never big. I mean, it sometimes at the beginning, it was like 15, 20 people. Even now, it's been enlarged under the last couple of NSIAs. I can't imagine it's more than about 75, 80 people, maybe a little bit more, grosso modo. So you don't have a lot of person power. There is no legislation backing you. And I gave a speech just before I left. I said, I'm not the deputy's bosses. More likely, they're my bosses. But Adam's 100% right. All you got is the inherent authority of the position. But more than anything else, you report to the prime minister. So you can invoke the name of the prime minister. And there's a certain moral suasion that goes with that. My brother held the position. He liked that term. He actually used it before a parliamentary committee. I've got this moral suasion because I work for the prime minister. So when I go to people and go, the prime minister needs this and he needs it right now, that tends to pack a bit of a punch.
Well, thank you for that, Vincent. I'm also wondering if, to paint more of a picture for a bit of a generalist audience that might be listening, or people who aren't super familiar with the role and its interactions within the greater bureaucracy and defense establishment. Vincent, I'm wondering if maybe, as best as you can, if you could walk us through maybe the day-to-day in your role, how you interact with the different departments, and then maybe focus on some specific challenges or scenarios you might encounter in the role. It might help us flesh out a greater picture of it. And then Adam, if you had anything to add, go ahead.
So you're asking for my PTSD to kick in here now. So you got to see me on screen. If
Therapy.
maybe this will be therapeutic. I don't know. I mean, it's like any deputy job, Josh, to be perfectly honest with you. It's very long. It's very intense. As I said it earlier, there's a lot at stake. So it's a stressful job. And that I think was also a common thread through the discussions. There are one or two deputies who I know quite well who are pretty laid back who said, I didn't get that stressed. But for most of them, it was like, no, it's a high intensity job, and it's, 10, 12, 14 hours a day. And other deputies can say the same. They're all high intensity jobs, but don't forget when you're the NSIA, again, you're reporting to the Prime Minister. You got that coordinating role, which most deputies don't have in terms of trying to coordinate an agency. Then that other role further outside of the government. There's a lot on your plate. I mean, I won't take you through a typical day because I don't think there is a typical day for the NSIA. It's at the tactical, operational, strategic level. I think that the NSIA tends to get drawn into a lot of operational stuff more than I think it should in a lot of respects, but that's driven by events, right? The old Harold Macmillan line, events, dear boy, events, and there's always a fire to put out. So NSIAs tend to be front and center. I remember a certain deputy telling me, try not to get dragged into the weeds. And I remember saying to him, but how do you not get dragged into the weeds on some of these issues? Because the PM's the one, I'm the one that's got to go brief the PM. And so if I don't know all the details, it's really, really tough for me. But any given day, there are going to be days where you're briefing the PM directly. For me, that was once every couple of weeks. For others, again, hate to keep on talking about my brother, but I think he did it 2, 3, 4 times a week, sometimes for Stephen Harper. Lots of meetings with your deputy colleagues, lots of committee meetings. There's a real big governance structure there that we talk about in the paper. Adam did a great job of disentangling it all in the earlier days. I helped out with the more recent days, but there used to be 13, 14, 15 national security related committees at the deputy level. Not as many now, but you go to a lot of meetings like all deputies do, but as the NSA, you end up chairing a lot of them. So there's a lot of pressure there. You try to find time in the day to actually read stuff and absorb it. I mean, you're meeting with your own staff a lot, you're getting brief, but for me, I used to get in very early in the morning, 7 o'clock, and the first hour is reading an intel pack. So you'd have all the intel coming in, raw intel, human intel reports, finished assessed products, and I try and find at least an hour at the beginning of the day to just get through that. My staff would put a package on my desk and go, here it is. And sometimes I'd get behind and I'd be reading the package that morning from the day before, 2 days before, they'd be stacked up. But you had to stay on top of the intel. It was really important. And it's one of the challenging parts of the job, is trying to stay on top of that. I remember during the whole commission being asked how many documents I read over the course of, I wasn't even there the job that long. It was under 2 years. And I think it came up to about 7,000, 8,000 documents I'd read. So you can imagine someone who's in the job for 3, 4, or 5 years. So it operates on so many different levels. There's a lot of travel involved. I didn't have to travel that much because it was during the pandemic. And so the only trip I took was to Washington to see Jake Sullivan, and that was it. Couldn't travel. But you talk to a lot of other NSAs and they'll say, oh, I was in Washington, I was in London, I was in Canberra, I was all over the place. So that gives you a bit of the taste. And then just depending on the event, just calls in the middle of the night. I got a few of those. PMO, we just heard about this, like what's going on? Or sometimes you're making the call and sometimes it's a call directly from the Prime Minister, and I had a few of those. And that's always interesting when your secret phone rings and you're like, oh, I wonder who that is. And hi, Vince, it's Prime Minister Trudeau. I got a couple of questions for you. So that gives you a bit of a taste of the job. I could go on for hours. Other NSAs could go on for days, I'm sure. But Adam probably can add on some stuff more the historical side.
Well, I think a couple of things that have come and gone and are there now. Certainly, the NSIA today is also the Secretariat of the Incident Response Group, so of a cabinet committee. They're also the Secretariat of the National Security Committee, Council of Cabinet. So on top of all the deputy work that you do, on top of all the work you do with your staff, on top of all the work you do out, you also have 2 cabinet committees that are your and your team's responsibility. I think that matters as well. Ideally, we are getting to the point where the National Security Intelligence Advisor is hopefully involved a little bit in succession planning or the management of a cadre of national security professionals, so that it becomes easier to replace outgoing advisors with incoming ones who are well qualified and well placed to do the job. We certainly haven't historically done much of that, and hopefully we're moving closer towards that as well right now. And I think you're also responding to the crisis of the day, not just operationally, but also in terms of how do we fine tune the structure of government to meet the new demands that weren't there when I got into the job. As Mitzi mentioned, committees, the number of committees, their responsibilities are all ever changing based on what the government is calling for and what the world is calling for.
That's a really important point, Adam. Thanks for reminding me, just in terms of focused on the prime minister, but focused on cabinet writ large. And so I was the secretary to the IRG, so did a lot of stuff with respect to the pandemic in the IRG, indigenous blockades of railways. There are a lot of different things. But during the pandemic, I spent a lot of my time briefing the cabinet committee on the pandemic, on intel, what China was up to in terms of their response, and Wuhan and one thing and another. All those names still ring around in my head. So yeah, you spend a lot of time with other ministers, and other ministers have a tendency to call you up and go, what do you think of this? What do you think of that? And love to talk to you about this. And Adam was saying that historically the NSIA was responsible for security for MPs, et cetera. I mean, that evolved where I got engaged in a lot of discussions on security for cabinet ministers, and especially over the last number of years, as you know, threats to cabinet ministers have gone right through the roof. So I would often be dealing either directly with ministers or their staffs, or with the RCMP. This minister's being threatened. This minister's had somebody lurking outside their front door, throwing eggs, or whatever the case may be. How can we help protect them? So you dealt with those kinds of things as well. So the PM, but also the political level writ large, I would include in that.
The role in its current iteration was created in about the mid-2000s. And in your piece, you kind of detail some of the changes and innovations brought to the role and some of the practices initiated by various NSIAs throughout the years. So, Adam, maybe you could detail some of those most important or impactful practices brought into the role. And from there, maybe you could both reflect on what's needed in the role and how can it continue evolving so that it meets the moment that we're in now.
So a couple of things that come to mind. Formalizing the way that intelligence was gathered and assessed and coordinated for government was something that was the original intelligence and security coordinator, or security intelligence coordinator. The government changed the name a couple of times. That original job was a major innovation in government. Establishing the intelligence priorities of the cabinet or of the government, the annual intelligence priorities, and then it evolved to publishing those intelligence priorities in more recent years was something new. And then testifying to the publication of those intelligence priorities was another addition. This whole idea of public face to the advisor, and as a result, the public face to national security has evolved over time. Vincent was huge in that, in making an actual public speech at CG that explained the job and answered questions. So the NSIA, when it started, was a secret job. Nobody really knew much about it. Even as late as the Harper era, I think Justin Ling portrayed one of the national security advisors as sort of one of the most powerful secretive persons in town. They knew they had a lot of power, but nobody knew anything about them. And the only way you would find out is if they testified before a Senate committee or a parliamentary committee. So the explicit emphasis on an outward face is new, and I think is quite important as well. The amount of travel that the NSIA does with the Prime Minister has evolved from none to a fair bit, depending on the relationship between the Prime Minister and the NSIA. Having an additional public servant there who is capable of adding value in terms of assessments of intelligence and security, and sometimes foreign policy as well, is something that has changed over time. So those are a few that come to mind right away.
I would agree with all of that. I think the transparency piece is very important. It's a position that's become more prominent, I think, especially over the last couple of NSIAs, driven again by events, whether it was the Freedom Convoy or Afghanistan or the Hogue Inquiry into Foreign Interference. You've got NSIAs now appearing before commissions, but also parliamentary committees on a regular basis and giving more speeches. So previous NSIAs, including myself, would give the occasional speech, but I think they're much more public facing now. And that's a good thing, because I think more transparency is important. And in that respect, I think the issuance of a mandate letter by the Prime Minister to the NSA was really, really important. So it, again, took the NSA out of the shadows and also made it very clear what the expectations were for the NSA by the Prime Minister. And this also was good for the rest of the community, because they understood what exactly the NSA had to do. And so that helps empower the NSA. We were talking before about moral suasion or invoking the name of the PM. Now you can actually wave a mandate letter in front of a deputy and go, read it. This is what we've got to do. The PM has said, this is what we got to do. And so there would be no pushback in terms of, stay out of our turf or what have you. And there are tensions at times between the NSIA and certain deputies. That's natural. We talk a little bit about the tensions between the NSA and the deputy at public safety, for example, that's again been throughout the history. So I think that's been, that's an important thing. And I hope that as we move forward, that transparency remains a prominent feature, and it becomes even more so. I think that we talk a lot about in the final section, the balances within that job. And one of the delicate balances is the domestic versus the international. And that I always say that national security, I think for a lot of Canadians, the national sounds like domestic. You've got national security, then international security. I always say that national security is a big overarching theme. But there's if you see it as a coin, there's a domestic side to the coin and the international side to the coin. And so the NSIA does both. And one of the big innovations about 15 years ago, one of the NSAs actually decided that the Foreign and Defense Policy Advisor would report through the NSA. And that, I think, was an important development in as much as it got the NSA more involved on the international side. All these threats that we have, or most of them, originate overseas. They've got an international dimension to them. And when I was NSA, I actually didn't have the FNDP advisor reporting through me. The clerk decided to change it. But I'd have phone calls from, the national security advisor in the U.S., who's probably more international than he is domestic, wanting to talk to me about international stuff. And I'd be going, well, I'm not really the guy. It's the FNDP advisor down the hallway. And it was awkward and it didn't work out. So I think that was a good innovation. I hope they keep it that way. They keep the Foreign Defense Policy Advisor reporting through the National Security Advisor. The intel piece has been interesting, and the name was changed from NSA to NSIA. I was never a big fan of it, and I've spoken out publicly, and Adam and I have had this discussion before about I'm not sure if the NSIA should be spending, in my case, probably 60-70% of my time giving intelligence briefings. I think that should be more dedicated to an individual like a director of national intelligence, providing the intel briefs, and that the NSA focus more on policy and operations and getting stuff done. That's for some quite controversial when I say this, but I still wonder if it's not something that we should look at. And then the other balance we've already talked about is I think trying to get the NSA more out of the weeds. Again, it's a part of the job, and I think any NSA listening to this would go, don't give me that. Of course, you've got to be in the weeds. You've got to be managing all this stuff. But there was one NSA who held the pen on the only national security strategy we've ever had. That was Rob Reich. I think it was the right thing to do. It was written from the center. To the best of our knowledge, the current national security strategy, current in as much as we think it's being drafted and it may be out soon, is being written out of the center. I like that. I think it's the right place to be. And I think the National Security Advisor needs to be, or Intelligence Advisor needs to be more strategic in that regard. And having the pen on the national security strategy and then helping implement it. If you've actually written it for the government, you can say, I know what we were trying to do here. I think that would be really good. And then finally, just having that National Security Council, I think, is really, really important. I hope they keep it, because it's a cabinet committee. Next prime minister could come in and go, I don't want it anymore. But I think the NSC empowers the National Security and Intelligence Advisor to a considerable extent. The NSA is the secretary to the cabinet and gets to have a real say in the intelligence that goes up to be discussed, to help inform the decision making. So that I think the NSC and the NSIA kind of go hand in hand in a lot of ways. So I hope they keep it. So I'll stop there.
Adam, did you have anything to add to what Vincent said?
The only thing I would add is that I found, as an outsider looking in, that the NSA position was seemed to be easier, or folks seemed to be less exhausted when they talked to us when their team was smaller, ironically, than it was when it was bigger, because when it was smaller, they couldn't manage everything. And they had to delegate because they just didn't have the team to do so. Those who tried to build their office tended to be more exhausted in the end. So I think one of the ways of keeping the position strategic is keeping the office smaller. Now, that's hard because, as Vincent says, if the prime minister wants to know what's going on, they're coming to you. And if you don't have the team to tell you, that's a problem. But ideally, I think that's a way to manage that would be better rather than worse.
And that's a really good point. And sometimes it's not a matter of the NSIA deciding they want a bigger team and they build it, but they get stuff thrown at them. So one of the NSIAs had emergency response under her, and that was mandated by government. I don't know if it was advice from the public service to the government, but sometimes you get stuff jammed down your throat and you have to get on with it. But I agree with Adam. Virtually every single interview, it was lean and mean. And Margaret Bloodworth in particular, I think, said to us, Adam, PCO and NSIA is part of PCO. They're not supposed to, as a general rule, doing all this stuff. They don't do the heavy lifting. The departments do the heavy lifting. I would argue that there are exceptions, and when you're developing a strategy, that should come from the center. But that's an exception, not a rule. The heavy lifting's got to be done by the line departments and agencies.
Thank you both for this conversation. We've delved a lot into the intricacies and dynamics of the NSIA role. We've looked at the history and the evolution of the role. For the last 10 minutes or so, I'm hoping we can kind of zoom out a bit and have a bit more of a broader conversation on Canadian national defense and security. One of the interesting passages in the CG paper was this, and I'll quote it. Revolutions of foreign interference in Canadian elections and accusations of foreign state-sponsored murders of Canadian citizens continue to make it hard to believe that the federal government takes national security as seriously as it should. So I think we would all agree that the world is becoming more dangerous. Canada has historically benefited from being neighbors and sharing a good relationship with the United States, global superpower. And the answer might be obvious to us or those in the Ottawa bubble or in the national defense and security community. But can we talk about where this, seeming complacency might emanate from when it comes to taking defense and security seriously? Whether recent events might finally be the catalyst needed for Canada to take defense more seriously and proactively. I do note also that in your paper, you kind of talk about how there's an ebb and flow of Canadian defense and security investment and attention, and it's often the catalyst for which is various crises that have occurred. So would either of you like to speak to this at all?
Well, I would say that it's a paradox in that you want the public to pay more attention to security and defense. But the way the public pays more attention to security and defense is if there's a fail. So we have a 9/11 of our own. The public will pay more attention to security and defense. But we don't want to have a 9/11 of our own. So it's tricky to figure out how to make this work to get the public to pay more attention without having the type of national crisis or tragedy that would compel that attention. So I find it difficult to explain what exactly we should do. I'm from the school that says that any Canadian is entirely within their rights to say we have a government, so I don't have to worry about some of these things quite so much, I'm which means that I'm not going to pressure the government to worry about this so much because I'm not going to pay attention to it because I got an affordability issue and I've got a mortgage or I've got rent and these other things. So I think it's hard. It's genuinely difficult to get Canadians to care more unless something terrible happens. Now, to get the town to care more, that's different. Maybe Vincent could talk to that. But to get Canadians to care more, I think is very hard. I hope it remains. Let me say, I hope it remains really hard.
I would agree with that. Josh, you've asked me this question before, I think, on this podcast. Where does this all come from? And I've given the answer, I think, that most historians or commentators usually give. It's partly geography, and we'd be far away from where a lot of these crises have taken place, and we always feel it's someone else's problem, although we inevitably get drawn into them, right? And then we have to try and find the resources. Geography isn't really a factor anymore. I think it hasn't been a factor for a long time. Canadians just don't realize it, but even less so now. And then, of course, the United States. And now, we're beside the world's strongest power, and they've been there to protect us. Well, that's kind of up in the air now, right? It's a big question mark. So how do we move on from this? 100% right. It seems to be crises. And we haven't had a 9/11. We haven't had a Pearl Harbor. We haven't had those big events that really would catalyze it. But I think the world is dangerous enough right now, writ large, and there are so many different threats coming from so many different vectors or sources in this expanding definition of national security, that it's not going to. It doesn't necessarily have to be a single crisis anymore. I think it comes back to transparency. You asked that question before, and Adam's talked about, and I've talked about it. I think that the government's getting better at it. I think that the Prime Minister's been better at it. We have to talk about this publicly. In the past, I think governments haven't wanted to really talk about it because it hasn't been a priority. And, I was told all the time, it's not a priority for this government because it's not a priority for Canadians. And my response was always, well, do you want to make it a priority for Canadians? You got to talk about it. So having an NSIA out there talking about the threats, not fear mongering, not, oh my God, the sky's crashing down on us, but talking about the threats. When I was in the job and after I left the job, I was always a big proponent of a national public threat assessment coming out every year, where you tell Canadians what the threats are out there and the extent to which they should be perhaps worried, and supporting investments in defense and security intelligence and so on. So talking about it, and now we don't really have a choice but to talk about it, given the way the world is. I think I've said this on your show before, but Prime Minister Carney's speech to the monk school many months ago, and he's talking about defense expenditure increases. That was one of the best speeches the Prime Minister gave on defense and security in a long time, in my view, because there was a very, very real politic take on the state of the world, and that the world was not in a good place. When's the last time you heard prime ministers talk like that? So we have to have that discussion and not wait for the crisis. Not wait for the crisis. We'll see if we can pull it off. But given the state of the world right now, there's no shortage of threats to talk about, starting with the one just south of our border.
I think I'd be comfortable with the NSIA's doing what Vincent did annually at CG, an annual talk about the state of national security in Canada that got some public attention. It's part of the mandate letter now. To do public outreach. And if it was regularized, at least you would get the bubble, which tends to be very insular and not security focused. The bubble itself would start to pay a little bit more attention, which would gradually spread things out. We also need more mainstream journalists to understand security better than they do. They don't. The national security and defense beat is so limited. We need to expand the scope of folks who are capable of reporting effectively on these issues.
That's a really important point. And I think the word that is in the mandate letter, Adam, is education. The responsibility of the NSIA to educate the Canadian public. And I put that right at the top of the list, quite frankly, right at the top of the list.
So, gentlemen, thank you for your reflections. We've been chatting for almost about 45 minutes here. To wrap this conversation up, put a nice bow on it, I'm wondering if you from your outsider perspective, as you've called it, Adam, and Vincent, from your work with your boots on the ground in the position, if you might be able to offer some final thoughts or reflections based on the research and work that's gone into the paper from your experience, and if you might have any recommendations for current holder of the role or for future holders of the role, or just any insights that you think are important for the audience listening.
I would hesitate from where I am to tell an NSIA what they should or shouldn't do, but I would say that there is value in Canadians understanding how their government works and why it works the way that it works. And that's one of the reasons we did this. And I think we need to do more of this type of work. There is in an increasingly dangerous international environment, I would suggest that there is a greater role for history than we've recognized in recent years. That understanding the context and where things came from and why decisions were made will do a real service to us going forward when we're faced with new challenges.
And I'd be reluctant to provide direct advice to the current NSIA as well. I had my time and my shot at the job, but I would just say, Josh, I think the trend line is looking a little bit better over the last couple of years in terms of what governments have done, and even the Trudeau government, which came under a lot of criticism for what they did on national security. We have a list of some of the things that it did do at the end, and so whether it's the creation of the National Security Council, the mandate letter, improving the CSIS legislation, improving the ICA, the Investment in Canada Act. There's been a lot of things that have been done to move us in the right direction. And I'm not even touching on defense and where we are in defense. So continue with that, build on it. And I'd said before the last election that given what Trudeau had started to do, you could go in one of two directions here. You could say, well, I ticked that box, done a few little things. Now we go back to the way we traditionally are, which is focusing on domestic issues, et cetera, et cetera. Or you can say, this was a good foundation. This is a good foundation. Now we got to build on it. You got to build on it. So the one thing I'd say in that regard, all the focus on defense right now and 5% and all the kit and the things we're going to be doing, don't remember the broader national security remit. And for organizations like CSIS and CSE, for National Security Advisor, Public Safety, the RCMP, CBSA, they need the direction, they need the guidance, they need the authorities, and above all else, they need the resources. They need the money to actually get stuff done. So think big. And I guess my last piece is just a national security strategy would be nice because it starts at the strategic level. But we'll see if that comes to pass.
Well, gentlemen, thanks for joining us today. Vincent, I note that for our listeners, when we started this podcast, it was still very much light out where you are, and now it's black. So thanks for bearing with us, and thanks for
winter in Shelby for you.
Thanks for coming on too, and reiterating as well some of the points you've made on the past in the podcast, which I think are important for audiences just tuning in because they are very important insights that I think we should continue sharing. So gentlemen, thank you for such an insightful conversation. Vincent Rigby, Adam Chapnick, Vincent and Adam, I hope you'll come on again in the future. And to our audience, I encourage you to read the latest piece for CG, Getting Serious About National Security. That's all for today's episode. The Expert Series is released every Friday. If you want to learn more about the CDA Institute, follow us on social media, visit our website at cdainstitute.ca, or subscribe to our newsletter for the latest updates on Canadian defense and international security. If you have comments or feedback about what you heard in today's episode, email Josh at cdainstitute.ca. I'm Josh Malm. Until next time.